FATCA is a U.S. law that was enacted in 2010, and basically it's an attempt by the United States to force banks worldwide to, one, hunt for anybody who the United States in its sole discretion deems to be a U.S. person. That would include a U.S. citizen, and basically turn the information over to the Internal Revenue Service. Now, that has been facilitated by an agreement between the governments of Canada and the United States, pursuant to which Canada changed a number of its laws to basically obligate the Canadian banks and other financial institutions to, one, search for, now I want to make it very clear here, this is not so much Americans in Canada as Canadian citizens who are resident in Canada that happen to have been born in the United States, to search for that group of people and basically turn their banking information over to the Canada Revenue Agency, which will then turn it over to the Internal Revenue Service in the United States.
Aren't they protected by privacy legislation?
Well, they were prior to the government of Canada signing the agreement with the United States. The problem that the banks had before was that it would violate privacy laws for the banks to hunt down people who were born in the United States and turn that information over to anybody. But as a result of the FATCA IGA, Canadian laws were changed to make that disclosure mandatory. So it used to violate privacy legislation. Now this kind of sort of search and seizure and disclosure is mandatory under Canadian law.
So now this happened back in September, and I understand the members of your group were upset with the Conservative government, which was in power at the time, but they're also now upset with the Liberal government because they had seemed to be opposed to everything prior to the election. Now they're in power, but nothing much seems to be happening on this file. Do I have that right?
Well, that's true. I don't think it's a question so much of the Conservative government or the Liberal government. I think it's a question of the government of Canada entering into an agreement with the United States to single out certain specific Canadian citizens based primarily on place of birth, regardless of whether they view themselves as Americans or not, and make their banking information available to the Internal Revenue Service.
So what are you trying to do about that then?
Well, we brought a lawsuit against the government of Canada and the Federal Court of Canada, which basically is based on two things. The first would be that this is not authorized by the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, which was the legal basis or the excuse given for this. And secondly, that it, in our view, it fairly clearly and obviously violates certain provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights, including the equality rights provision that would prohibit discrimination based on citizenship, place of origin, etc.
Now, there is another handover from the Canada Revenue Agency to the IRS scheduled for September, I understand. How is that going to work?
Well, it's every September. Essentially, the way it works is that the United States, under its own domestic law, defines who they regard as a U.S. person. In other words, the definition of who the Canadian banks are required to out on this is determined completely by the United States. And pursuant to the agreement, they'll be running through the account records of Canadian citizens who also are resident in Canada. And if indicia, if U.S. indicia, which would be a place of birth and some other things would be found, then that information would be turned over to the Canada Revenue Agency, which would then turn it over to the Internal Revenue Service. And this is an annual event.
Yeah, unless your lawsuit does its job. All right, well, thank you very much for being with us.
You're very welcome.